About 2 or 3 hours after we fell asleep, I woke up to find Piper sitting up next to me, wide awake with a look of naked terror on her face. I sat up too, but couldn't see or hear anything, and I just said, "What? What's happening?" But by that time Piper had started yelling, and I practically had to smother her to shut her up, because I was so scared of someone hearing us. She was thrashing around like a person having a fit, and trying to claw my face with her hands, and I thought maybe she was suffering from some form of mushroom poisoning. "No!" she screamed, and I thought she meant me, but her eyes weren't focused outward at all, even though I was trying to put my hand over her mouth, and she was shouting, "Stop! Stop!" And I was concentrating on her so hard that the noise in my head, when I finally heard it, too, took me completely by surprise. It started softly, like a throbbing noise far away, and for a second I looked around like mad, thinking it must be near us. But all around was quiet and empty, except for nature and the night. Gradually over the throbbing I could make out something like a tape played too fast, so the voices were all squeaky and odd like cartoon alien voices, and then I started to pick out individual noises, and then I could hear people crying and screaming, and by then the voices were so loud and so desperate, and it was so horrible, that I could only hug my head and beg them to stop, stop, stop. Piper wasn't screaming anymore, and just lay curled up on the ground with her eyes squeezed shut, and her hands clamped over her ears, and she looked so terrified that I forced myself to go over to her and try to help, but she kicked and hit me when I came near, so I backed off, and she just rocked herself back and forth like a crazy orphanage baby trying to comfort itself. All this time the noises were screaming louder and louder in my head, and I had to get away from it, but nothing worked, and all I could do was make a kind of droning noise in my throat to drown it out, and after a while it started to fade, and got fainter and fainter, and eventually the throbbing noise went too, and it was silent all around us again, and I threw up. Piper finally opened her eyes and crouched up on her knees, and she looked at me panicky and wild like a cornered animal, and said, "We have to help them." And I felt angry, and said, "Help who?" Thinking we're the ones who need help if we're going to die in the woods from mushroom poisoning. But Piper didn't answer, and just kept saying, "We have to help them, we have to help them," over and over, like a desperate tape on a loop. There was no moon at all that night, and no point trying to walk because the darkness was so black we couldn't even see the path, and though Piper was frantic to get going, even she realized it was useless until we had some light. We tried to go back to sleep, but it didn't work, and so we waited, trembling in the cold night air, until it started to get light enough to walk, and then we walked and didn't stop until nightfall, when we collapsed and didn't even have the energy to put up our tent, but just put the blankets down on the ground, and I kept thinking I could feel bugs crawling on me and stones under my bones, and Piper half went to sleep, but kept waking up with a jolt, and finally, just when the sky was starting to get light, we both fell asleep like vampires. A few hours later we woke up sweaty and anxious, and once more walked as fast as we could, given how exhausted and starving we were, in a kind of hollow, desperate silence. Neither of us mentioned the mushroom night again. It was 2 days since we'd come to the bend in the river, and I figured if we didn't get lost, another day of walking should get us to Kingley. I tried not to think about what we would find when we got there. There was no point letting my brain get there first. It might decide to turn back.